Okay, so I'm sitting here. When I say Daniel, and I want to give you a title, what is your title? Well, because there's Father David in Hilversum, and then Reverend Grant.
To be a fun thing to ask me on camera. Okay. Actually, yeah.
Okay.
To just get things going, yeah.
Aren't we on camera now?
I think so.
Okay. All right. So what is it, Reverend Daniel? Is it His Holiness?
Just Daniel. I mean, my official title is Reverend Daniel, but okay. Daniel is fine.
We'll do Reverend Daniel, because this is going to go up on a Christian channel and all that kind of stuff. And you don't have your collar on.
Yeah.
So you know. All right. So Reverend Daniel and I are going to have a discussion about what we will be doing at the All Saints Men's Evening coming up here later this month, and that's on religion and politics. And we just wanted to have, we're trying some new things out here. And all of this stuff came because we kept going to McDonald's for coffee and talking about these things, and the religion and politics, you know, it's all the stuff that your mom told you not to discuss. You know, don't ruin Christmas dinner by discussing religion and politics, and which is exactly what we're going to do. So what I'd like to do is just walk through how we can discuss this from a biblical point of view. You know, where can we look in the Bible to get any idea about this? And we all know that at this moment, we have a lot of, for example, evangelicals in the United States who are being told by their pastors to vote for Donald Trump. Now, you can think about that what you will, but is there really a biblical basis for Christians sort of going out in the world and voting Christian or voting on Christian issues? Is there an injunction from God to participate in this way? And so we're just going to have a discussion here based on the Bible about, you know, how should we even look at this? And part of this is just a little podcast from me on my The Workman channel, but it's also a preparation for any of the men coming to the All Saints Men's Evening. So, according to you, where might we start? I think I told you earlier, I did a sermon last night on Acts 16, and in Acts 16, you know, Paul has gone to Philippi. He's met Lydia, this lady who sells purple. She's a Jew, clearly a Jew. Then he cures this lady who had a spirit in her that allowed her to foretell the future and that kind of thing. By the way, some very woke people say, oh, Paul hated women, and this is the proof because he took this woman's livelihood away. You know, so Paul does the right thing for the right reasons, and today he still gets pilloried for these things. Mm-hmm. But it did take away a money earner for some of the men who owned her. Yep. I mean, she was a slave.
Yep.
So, you know, they started saying, you know, Paul's a bad guy. It's these Jews. And so, you know, they were giving Jews and by extension Christians a bad name, even though they didn't deserve it, you know. And so this might encourage someone, maybe me, to say, well, you know, I don't want to engage as a Christian because then I'll be labeled and they might take me to the square and lash me, and I can't say, hey, I'm a Roman citizen, you know, and everybody get kind of nervous. I can't do that. So, you know, what's in it for me to sort of hang out my Christian beliefs, my Judeo-Christian beliefs? So that's one thing that, you know, just having engaged with Acts 16, I think I immediately start thinking of that.
it's a complex question, and I think it's one of these questions which are matters of wisdom. So it's not one of the questions that we are going to get a yes or no answer in the Bible and the New Testament. That's why we need to wrestle with this.
I would like a yes or no answer.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And that would mean that wherever we end on this thing, we sort of want to, we don't want to bind people's consciences. So it might be ultimately that there's a place for voting a particular way or choosing a particular party, and that probably is the right thing to do.
But what do you mean by bind people's consciences? Because isn't that exactly what we're trying to do? We're trying to say, this is how you're thinking, this is something biblical, and we're kind of trying to bind.
Yeah, I think there are things in the Bible that are straightforward, that are really clear. You know, the Bible says, do this, and we want to be very clear on that.
Yeah.
I think there are certain things that the Bible gives is not very clear. Maybe the Bible gives us leads or the Bible is not black and white on these things.
Yeah.
And in those situations, then I think there's a place for Christians wrestling with things.
Yeah, okay.
And not being guilt tripped, unnecessarily. So it's not something we want to, make people guilty on if they do not think like us. Even when I probably am right, I'm thinking biblically on this issue, and I think everybody should think biblically. I'm not saying I'm doing that. But even in that instant, I want to recognize that it's not one of those things the Bible is like super clear, black and white. It's an area where I think God expects us to wrestle, before we come to the truth.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not that prescriptive.
Yes.
As what I'm saying.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah.
And we just want to be careful. So we want people to honor God's words, and we want people to do what the Bible says. But that comes with responsibility, isn't it? Then you really want to be sure that whatever you're telling people to do is what God is telling them to do. You're not telling people to do what God is not telling them to do. Yeah. So there are things that we'll say if you're preaching, that say, thus says the Lord, this is what God says. It's very clear from the text. And then there are things that we say, I actually think this is the direction God is pushing us to.
Yeah.
People might think differently, and there are lots of factors to consider in this issue, but then it's good advice from the Bible.
So I guess we're getting the factors to consider from the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know in the United States, for example, that a lot of Christians will never ever vote Democrat because the Democrats are so pro-abortion. But maybe what you're saying is this shouldn't tell you not to vote Democrat, but it might say be aware of where the Democrats fall down in a biblical or a Christian way, as the Republicans will, as the Socialists will, as the Green Party will.
I think that's right, and there's a place I think there's a place for wrestling with.
Okay.
A particular ideology of a party.
Yeah.
And we're going to edit that out.
The catering here is excellent.
Thank you.
The catering is excellent. Thank you.
So I think there's a place to wrestle with, this party, the things that it is pushing are like really, really bad. So I think the abortion thing is a big problem.
Yeah.
Really big problem. Yeah. In fact, I think one of the things that I keep thinking about is just how, particularly in our world, even among solid Christians, they don't seem to be talking about abortion the way I think they should talk about it, because it's such a big thing. Look at the statistics of the number of children being killed. I don't think there's enough voice on this particular issue compared to other voices. So, for example, in the recent past, Christians have come up really to support things like climate justice and racial, and I think there's a point to some of those processes. I wonder if abortion is a much bigger thing than some of those issues, and yet there's a surprising silence from most Christian, most evangelical Christians. And I wonder if that also fits into the politics of it, because if there's, and of course there's a place to say, I mean, both sides, as far as I know, Trump has also not been very consistent on this issue. No. And so there's a place to wrestle with that. And yet, I think that's a really important issue to consider.
Yeah. So so we won't, we might get deeper into that, but going back to, so these are some of the issues we have to wrestle with. Going back to the Bible, where would you start to look in the Bible for guidance here? I think you mentioned Acts 17.
I would say probably start from the Old Testament. God has given us a Bible with two parts, so Old Testament, New Testament. And I value doing something called biblical theology. So go through the Bible, try to think about what's the Bible teaching on this particular topic. So begin to think about from where does the Bible talk about leadership and nationhoods. You could say there's something around, I mean, even right from Genesis 2, about just as Adam is created, there's sort of a world there, and Adam is created sort of as a king, a vice regent for God. I think especially in terms of a nation, you have to think about Israel as kings start to being appointed. And what is demanded of a king, what is expected of a king. King David, for example, set up as a great king. So I think there are examples there, and how a nation is supposed to run that we can learn from there. Of course, Israel is always tricky, because Israel is not just a nation, it's also a people of God. It's also a church in a sense, So it's not just a secular nation. It's also a religious nation, or rather a religious people in that sense. But I think there are lessons to be learned in those places about how should a nation run, a nation under God, under a leader who God has chosen. Who is the kind of a person that God would approve for a leader? I think. Especially all the kings in Israel, and God gives us a variety of kings that are not good, and then a variety of kings that are good. And most of the time, especially in the book of Kings, we are told why they were not good and why they were good. So there are lessons to be learned even in the Old Testament.
And so you're kind of saying we can apply those things to how we evaluate who we vote for.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Where would you go? So we can start in the Old Testament. I think also we see that Adam and Eve are they sort of have co-dominion over the earth. You could get the right for women to vote out of that, maybe. I know the arguments about the husband should vote because the husband's the head of the family, and that's why the women didn't have the vote. But as co-regents, there could be something there. So I'm just bringing that up, not to open up another can of worms, just to say, you can look at these things from different angles, and you can stay biblical and still have a slightly different idea about how you would like to see that in the political arena.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's something to be said about federal headship, federal leadership, I think, which you've lost. I think there's so much in the Bible about representative leadership. But again, that's a conversation for another day. But I think from Genesis 2 and the earlier chapters, we see sort of a sameness in ontological equality, as it's usually said. So men and women equal, created in the image of God. I think that gives them agency to both make decisions. And so men and women can vote. I think you can say that from Genesis 2.
Where should we as Christians, in your opinion, where should we land? What sort of part of the Bible should we land on as pretty good guidance for how we should move forward.
I think the things you can, of course, learn from the Old Testament. I think my sort of interpretive, one of my key interpretive principles is that the New Testament sort of written to us. So it's written to New Testament Christians. I think we are New Testament Christians. So if there are imperatives, for example, that are given to New Testament Christians, I think they apply fairly directly to us. And so Romans 13, for example, I think is a key verse on the issue of governance and governing authorities and all that. We probably
let's go to Romans 13, and let's make sure that we don't upset the catering by ignoring the lovely tea that we've been provided with here. This is a classic podcast. Joe Rogan would be jealous of our rooibos tea.
So, what is your preferred version?
Well, why don't we use NIV, since we use NIV in All Saints?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Are you expecting me to read?
Oh, I can read it if you want. I have an NIV here as well.
Great. Yeah. Why don't you read, and then you should
just start with 13. Is that what you want?
Yes, 13. I think 13 1 to 7.
13 1 to 7.
Deals particularly with this issue.
Okay, 13 1 to 7. So this is a submission to authorities. So it says, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, even if that governing authority is Saddam Hussein. Well, no, let's not get into weeds yet. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. And now I'm already feeling this desire within me to come up and say, well, but that was in that time, and of course, the Bible is extremely cosmopolitan. It is extremely modern. We have the Roman Empire and the Jewish hierarchy were no better than the nonsense that we see today. So, really, this is what we have to go on here.
Yeah, and I think this is even much more radical than we think, because I think, of course, I probably talked about this with you before. So when you think about applying the Bible to ourselves, there's this principle called via Corinth, and it could be via Rome or something like that. So the Bible writer is writing to the Corinthians, or writing to Rome, then to us. So it's always, rather than directly to us, it is to us, yes, but it goes through Corinth, or it goes through Rome. So it's always important to think about what's going on in Rome, because that really helps us to apply it.
Right.
And when you think about what's really going on in Rome, it's not good.
Yeah.
Because the governing authorities at that time, were brutal. These were pagans who were doing all sorts of evil. These were not nice people.
Yeah.
And some of the emperors in Rome, as Paul is writing this, these are not good people at all. These are pagans who are persecuting Christians, who are doing all sorts of evil things. Which makes it even quite radical, when Paul is writing this if these governing authorities are actually hating on Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point, because I think it probably applies. I'm sure it applies very much to us in the modern time. But if you look at it also in what was happening in Rome, and if you've studied Rome at all, it is a really brutal place where life is not really valued like we would think life should be valued today.
Yeah. And yet he says, authority, that kind of all authority is established by God, which is really shocking. Does that mean that those dictatorial, tyrannical authorities are governed by
like
God?
Saddam Hussein, was Saddam Hussein sort of...
Yeah, established by God. I think it's a really difficult thing
Joe
to
Biden?
wrestle with. Yeah.
Geert Wilders,
It's really interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting what Paul is saying here. But I think, so if you just zoom out a bit and just think, what is Paul doing here? And I think, so if you think about the context of Romans, and we've been preaching through Romans in at church, this is the second part of Romans, and Romans 9 to 11, Paul is talking to this, handling the Jewish problem, or the Jew-Gentile problem, and his desire that the Jews will come to faith, because at least until this point, the Jews are, for the most part, really resistant. So the Gentiles are coming to faith, the Jews not so much.
Yeah.
And he set out in Romans 9 to 11 his desire that the Jewish people would come to faith. And his Romans 11, I think, which is a really difficult passage, but he says he magnifies his ministry just so that he could provoke Israel to jealousy.
Yeah.
And if, as he magnifies his ministry to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles become Christians, and the Gentiles begin to live the way Israel should have lived, then probably Israel is going to wake up and think, those people are living exactly how God wanted us to live. Maybe we should join them. There's something attractive in them. It is then in that context that he writes this, because this is the kind of church that Paul thinks is going to provoke Israel to jealousy. This is the kind of church that other people are going to look at and think, wow, that's different. That's radical. We want to be part of that. So I think it's in that context. Paul wants this Christian to live in such a countercultural way that other people would be attracted to them.
Yes.
And so he doesn't want them to be sort of insubordinating our culture. So he wants them to be at peace with other people. So they don't want them to be, this subset of a population of a country that's always at loggerheads with the authorities. That's not attractive in a sense.
That's really interesting, because I'm linking that with something I saw on the Sean Ryan show, another excellent podcast. And the guy there was saying he was one of the Delta Force people hunting down Saddam. And what he noticed was that Saddam's barber and the person who gave him a bath and all these kind of things, they were all Christians.
Interesting. Wow.
Because a Muslim can say, I'm going to blow myself up and get my 72 virgins. Because if you die in jihad, in theory, you go straight to paradise. But Christians don't blow themselves up. In general. So Saddam had surrounded himself with Christians. And maybe this is it, in those societies where it's normal to avoid paying taxes. It's normal to do these kind of things. If you're a Christian, you are countercultural by saying, this is what the authorities expect of me, and since I'm living in this land, I will do those things. I remember when I was in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. There's no church in Saudi Arabia, we had to respect that or be thrown out, and we did. We had some Bible studies, but these were private in the home, and we weren't standing outside the mosque trying to evangelize, which you might be tempted to do, but that was the law in that land.
Yeah. So I think there's a place of, for example, you're being radically submissive to a tyrannical government, loving your enemies. I think it's still that principle that Jesus taught, and blessing those who persecute you. I think it's that kind of thing that Paul is teaching here, which of course would be very different from modern day America, I think. Because number one, modern day America, the government is not tyrannical, and at least against Christians. I think it would be different from a Christian that's mostly, at least in the Western world, most of our nations it's changing now, but have been historically very Christian in a sense.
Yeah, the foundation of the laws.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So the context then is slightly different from this. So this is a context where, as Christians, you're a tiny minority. You're not going to change anything politically.
Yeah.
I think that would be different from where I think there is a chance that Christians can change things politically, where there are a lot of Christians. Like it's possible that Christians are in government, for example, and could lobby things. So I think you also want to consider that.
But isn't this also? There's kind of a push. I'm not sure if it's sort of. So I should have looked this up before we started, but it's not Pentecostals. It may be like Reformed, where there's this push that says, look, we need to get Christians into government. And as more and more Christians take over more and more aspects of government, then we will bring in these Christian values, and that will usher in the millennium. This is sort of an amillennial or a post-millennial, kind of thing. That would imply that we need to really engage. I mean, we need to actually go out and get a government position.
Yes, I know. I've had that theology. I think I also can't remember the name. So it's apparently having Christians to have dominion, all the various spheres of society. I think I have problems with that. I think the goal is not just to have, a dominion in society for the sake of it. However, I think there's something good about, if it's possible and if it can be done legitimately, about promoting Christians to be in position of influence. When the Russians rule, our people benefit, when we have good people in power.
Right.
It's good for everyone.
Well, look at Joseph and Daniel, these kinds of moral men who come in and have a positive effect, even on regimes or kingdoms that are pretty darn oppressive.
Yeah, indeed. And that's why I think context is really important. So I think, as I see it, I'm probably wrong, the context in America, for example, is very different from the Dutch context or from the European context. In America, I think there's still a big sort of culture war. There's Christianity still has a huge influence. Yeah. And I think there's a place for these Christians to continue to fight for a sort of explicit dominance and even laws, that are Christian in society, which would be different from a European culture where, again, I think is fairly close to Rome, where Christians are a minority. Yes. And trying to, for example, fight the government, or influence that in a explicitly biblical way can be fairly countercultural, and not attractive.
I just saw a statistic in the Christian Post yesterday that said in the UK, most people are atheist, and say so. those people who believe in God, so I assume that includes Jews and Christians and Muslims, are the minority. Most people are just atheists.
Yeah, indeed. And therefore that means if you try to push maybe certain things that are explicitly Christian, for example, if you are in political power, it can backfire.
Yeah.
And I think it can ruin it will not serve this, what Paul once served here.
Right.
Well, I think that there's a place between that in the U.S., I think, from what I see. There's a place for cultural, if you call it that, for fighting, for explicitly biblical, godly principles in the public square. And I could be wrong, but I think that's what I think in my own assessment.
So if this were a sermon, let's say you had done this. I mean, we didn't plan this, but if this were a sermon on Romans 13, and it's like 2 weeks before the election or something like that, what would you give a congregation to go out thinking about? So they've followed this, and you've made a sermon of something like this on it. And what would you send Christians in a congregation out thinking about? What would they need?
Yeah, good question. I think from like what I started in the beginning by saying, I don't want to bind people's consciences on this. Yeah. So I would not tell them you have to vote A or B, otherwise you're sinning or something like that. You don't want to bind people's conscience or something the Bible does not bind their consciences on. But I think there are certain principles from Romans 13. So it's clear, for example, from Romans 13, that those in power are supposed to be a terror to those who do evil. So I want to look at the candidates that are standing and ask, which of them is a terror to those who are doing the wrong thing or those who are doing evil? Which of them is going to promote truth? And we're all sinful human beings, we're not voting. Even if you're voting for a pastor, the pastor is still broken and sinful, they're not going to get everything perfect.
There was a Reformed minister that said, you should remember that, what was it? The best of men are men at best.
Yeah. I think there's truth to that. Yeah, there's truth to that. So none of our political leaders is going to be perfect. It's going to be to fully align with God's word and what we want them to, and they're going to disappoint us in many ways. But I think the principle here is what governments are meant to do is to terrorize those who are evil. God has given them a sword to fight evil. Yeah. And I think that's a big part of what government's role is. Yeah. And I want to evaluate governments and those who are jostling for power on that basis, Are they people who, under God, even if they're not Christians, who would be a terror to evil? Or are they the ones to be promoting evil? Yeah. Are they the ones that are going to promote the goods as fast in their ability, and as, of course, it's going to be human and therefore fallen? I think that's a principle that I want to teach from Romans 13. Yeah. But it will be individual choices. I don't want, again,
So I need to go out and vote for the people that will terrorize, maybe not a good word, who will terrorize, who will punish those who are doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, indeed. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason.
Yes.
So the various types of authorities in the Bible, they're just very few authorities that are given the power to implement, to enforce the authority. So I think parents, God has given parents the power to enforce the authority by a whip. Whatever you think about that.
The state has taken that away. Anyway,
unfortunately,
continue.
Unfortunately. Yes. I think that's the same with the state. I think the state has been given the sword. So it's been given by God a divinely instituted way of enforcing the authority, the sword.
Yeah.
I think, and this is controversial, I think the church has that. So not the pastor. So the pastor leads by persuasion, by teaching. That's how authority in the church is exercised. Authority in the church is by teaching, is by convincing people and persuading people, and I think that's rather than a whip. But the church has a way to enforce its authority by expelling people. So I think various places, I think Jesus talks about it.
Yeah.
Paul talks about it. So it's not the pastor per se, it's the church.
Yes.
Has a way of enforcing the other. So I think those three authorities in the Bible.
Yeah.
And the state has not been given a sword for no reason.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important principle, I think I would want to teach. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that, of course, would be different. It will not be different. It will work out itself in various ways, in different contexts.
Yeah.
So I think that would look different in the Netherlands or in the UK than it would look in the US.
Yeah, for sure. And you can think of a lot of other places like Japan or China.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then you get really starts, so all the 120 million Christians in China, how are they supposed to behave? And you might say, well, Romans 13, they need to pay their taxes and
obey their leaders. Yeah.
Obey their leaders, and if they are told to go into military service,
Yeah.
I mean, it starts to become very, very, very complicated. So how do you properly follow Christ and follow Scripture in a world that is pretty cloudy and pretty unclear?
Yeah.
So. Yeah. Okay, well, that's what we'll be talking about in some depth during the men's evening. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please like, subscribe, and feed the algorithm. But please put in any comments that you have, even if there's snarky comments. Nice comments are also welcome. But put in any comments that you may have, and let us know if you like this kind of format. And until the next time, God bless.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Okay. I think that went okay, right?
Yeah.